Does anyone in this room speak Japanese? The question hung in the air of the Rideau Club's second-floor boardroom like smoke that wouldn't clear. 14 people sat around that mahogany table, lawyers, executives, 2 municipal officials from Ottawa's Economic Development Office, and not one of them moved. Not one of them even looked up. Haruto Tanaka set down his pen, slowly, deliberately. The kind of slow that tells you a man has made a decision before anyone else in the room realizes there's a decision to be made. He stood up. And that was when everything began to fall apart. Nobody paid much attention to the man pushing the housekeeping cart down the 14th floor hallway that morning. Why would they? He was 63 years old, wore a gray uniform that was a size too large for his frame, and moved the way people move when their knees have been carrying heavy things for too many years. His name was Gerald Osei, worked at the Chateau Laurier for 11 years, 3 months. And, if you asked him, which nobody ever did, about 2 weeks, Gerald had a face that had seen weather. Not the polished or distinguished kind of aging that gets described in novels, the real kind that comes from loss. His wife, Abina, had passed 6 years ago. His daughter lived in Winnipeg and called on Sundays, sometimes. He had 2 grandchildren he'd seen in photographs, more than in person. He rented a 1-bedroom apartment on Dalhousie Street, took the bus to work, ate his lunch. Usually a sandwich he made himself the night before, alone in the staff locker room because the break room on the service floor got too loud and he was, by nature, a quiet man. What people did not know about Gerald Osei, what nobody in that hotel had ever thought to ask, was that he had spent 12 years working as a senior trade disa, a senior trade interpreter for the Ghana Trade Commission, stationed in Tokyo from 1987 to 1999. He had negotiated agricultural contracts in Japanese so precise that his counterparts had once told him his vocabulary was better than their own junior staff raised. His daughter in a small apartment in Minato, Tokyo, taken her to school in Japanese, argued with her teachers in Japanese, her bedtime stories in Japanese when she was small and cried in Japanese when she was sick. He had left that life behind. It is a long story, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into small talk. Gerald had stopped trying to tell it years ago. People see a man in a gray uniform pushing a cart, and they have already finished writing the story of who he is. He had learned not to argue with it. That Tuesday morning he was restocking the minibar in room 1408 when his radio crackled. Front desk. Something about the boardroom on the second floor needing fresh water service. Could someone from housekeeping bring up 2 pitchers? Gerald took the elevator down. The Rideau Club boardroom had been booked for 3 weeks by Norland Capital Partners, a real estate development firm headquartered in Toronto. They were in the final stages of closing a $340 million mixed-use development deal. 3 towers, retail space, and a transit hub in what the city was calling the new East End Corridor. The lead investor was Tanaka Haruto, representing a Japanese infrastructure fund out of Osaka called Kuroshio Development Holdings. The deal had taken 14 months to reach this table. Diane Mercer, Norland's VP of Acquisitions, had been the one driving it. She was sharp, well-prepared, and had, by all accounts, done everything right. She had flown to Osaka twice. She had brought a translator both times, a young woman named Claire, who worked for a translation agency in Mississauga and whose Japanese was technically proficient, but had, according to Tanaka's team, a certain flatness to it, a textbook quality. The words were right, but the register was off. In Japan, register is not a small thing. Claire had not been booked for the closing session. It was supposed to be a formality. The contracts were ready. The terms had been agreed upon. It was simply a matter of signatures. Except that when Tanaka's legal counsel, a man named Fujimoto, opened the English-language contract and began cross-referencing it against the Japanese summary document that Norland had sent to Osaka 3 weeks prior, he found something. He leaned over and spoke quietly to Tanaka, in Japanese, for nearly 2 minutes. Tanaka's face did not change. This is a skill particular to certain kinds of experienced negotiators. The ability to receive information that is, in fact, alarming and show nothing. He simply folded his hands on the table and waited until Diane Mercer finished her sentence. Then he said in English, "I have a concern about the governance clause." Diane looked at her legal team. The governance clause had been discussed. It was standard. She was sure of it. "Can you be more specific?" she asked. Tanaka said something then, not in English. He turned to Fujimoto, and they spoke together in rapid Japanese for nearly a minute, and the room sat in the particular uncomfortable silence of people who do not understand what is being said and are too professional to show how much that bothers them. Finally, Tanaka looked up. "I would like to continue this conversation in Japanese. It is important that the precise language be clear. I was told a Japanese interpreter would be available today." Diane's assistant, a young man named Kevin, pulled out his phone immediately. "Claire from Mississauga," he called. It went to voicemail. He texted her. He called again. Diane looked at her watch. She looked at the 14 people around the table. She said, "Does anyone here speak Japanese? Anyone?" Silence. Tanaka's chair moved back 2 centimeters. Just 2. But everyone in that room felt it. Gerald had been standing near the service entrance to the boardroom, both hands on the water pitchers, waiting for the right moment to enter without disrupting the meeting. He had been there for about 4 minutes, heard everything. He stood very still. There is a moment that happens sometimes in a life, a moment where everything that you are, everything you were, everything you quietly buried because the world didn't seem to have room for it, suddenly becomes exactly what is needed, not in a dramatic way, not with fanfare, just a quiet alignment, the way a key feels when it finally finds the right lock. Gerald Osei set the water pitchers down on the small table beside the service entrance. He straightened his uniform, the one that was a size too large for his frame. He took a breath, and then he walked into the boardroom. "Excuse me." 14 heads turned. Mercer looked at him with the particular expression of someone trying very hard to be polite while also being completely confused. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Gerald said. His voice was unhurried. "I couldn't help but overhear. I speak Japanese, if you need assistance." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. It had texture. It had confusion in it, and disbelief, and something else. A flicker, just a flicker, in Tanaka Haruto's eyes. Fujimoto said something under his breath in Japanese. It was, roughly translated, "Is this a joke?" Gerald turned to him, not to Diane, not to the room, and said, in Japanese, the formal register, appropriate for a business meeting of this significance. "I understand your concern about the governance clause. If it would help, I am happy to assist in clarifying the language directly. I worked as a trade interpreter in Tokyo for 12 years. The room did not know what he had said, but they watched Fujimoto's face change, and they watched Tanaka Haruto go very still. Tanaka spoke, in Japanese. Slowly. A test. Gerald answered also slowly, also in Japanese, also in the formal register. Tanaka spoke again. Faster this time. Gerald answered again. What happened next lasted about 40 minutes, and the people around that boardroom table, the lawyers, the executives, the 2 municipal officials, understood perhaps 30% of it. They understood this. The man in the gray uniform was conducting a conversation of real complexity with the lead investor of a 340 million yen deal, and the lead investor was not just tolerating it. He was engaged. He was leaning forward slightly. At one point, he almost smiled. What Gerald had understood, standing at the service entrance for 4 minutes, listening, was that the problem was not the governance clause itself. She walks her. The problem was a discrepancy between the English contract and the Japanese summary document, specifically around the question of decision-making authority in the event of a partnership restructuring. The English document used the phrase mutual agreement between parties, which in Canadian legal language implies equal standing. The Japanese summary, however, had been translated using a phrase that in Japanese commercial law implies one party holds a decisive vote. It was not necessarily fraud, girls. It may have been a translation error, a significant one. Gerald explained this to both sides, carefully switching between English and Japanese, asking clarifying questions, restating each position to make sure both parties understood what the other had actually said. Not just the words, but the meaning behind the words, the concern, the intent. Diane Mercer's legal team asked to take a 20-minute recess. At recess, one of the senior lawyers, a man named Robert, who had been practicing corporate law in Ottawa for 30 years, sat next to Gerald at the small table outside the boardroom door and said, "Where did you learn to do that?" Gerald said. "Tokyo, a long time ago." Robert looked at him for a moment. "You've been working here how long?" 11 years, Gerald said. Robert didn't say anything else, but he sat with that for a while. When the boardroom reconvened, the lawyers had proposed a revised clause. Gerald translated it into Japanese. Fujimoto had 3 questions. Gerald translated each question into English, waited for the response, related the response back. Tanaka asked for one additional amendment, a minor one related to the audit process. Gerald translated it precisely, including the nuance that in Japanese, the phrasing Tanaka used carried an implication of good faith rather than legal demand. The distinction mattered. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Haruto Tanaka signed the contract. He stood up afterward, not to shake Diane Mercer's hand first, as protocol might have suggested, but to walk to the small table where Gerald was sitting. He extended his hand. He said, in Japanese, "I have been in this country for 4 days. You are the first person I have spoken with who actually heard what I was trying to say." Gerald shook his hand. He said, also in Japanese, "I hope the rest of your time here is easier." Tanaka nodded once. Then he said, in careful English, perhaps the most English he had spoken all day, "Thank you." Mercer found Gerald in the hallway afterward. He had the slightly off-balance look of a person who has just rearranged a significant piece of their understanding of how the world works, and hasn't quite finished putting it all back together yet. "I need to ask you something," she said. Gerald waited. "Didn't you?" She stopped, started again. "Did you know when you came in here that you could help?" "I thought I might be able to," he said. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" 11 years. "Why didn't anyone here know what you could do?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have an answer. He had several. He had been thinking about answers to that question, in one form or another, for a long time. "People don't usually ask," he said finally. "When you get to a certain point, you stop expecting them to." Diane looked at him for a long time. She was not an unkind woman. She had simply, like most people, been looking at a gray uniform and seeing only what it was designed to tell her. "I'd like to make this right," she said. "I'm not sure exactly how yet, but I'd like to try." Gerald nodded. He did not say don't worry about it, the way he might have once. He did not make it easier for her. He just said, "I'd appreciate that." The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Real life doesn't work like that, and anyone who has lived past 60 knows it. Gerald didn't wake up the next morning with a corner office and a new career. Things moved slowly, the way institutional things always do, but they moved. Norland Capital Partners reached out to the hotel's management. There was a conversation. Several, actually, about Gerald's background, his qualifications, his availability. A consulting arrangement was proposed, then formalized, for any future dealings with Japanese partners, and Norland had 2 more in the pipeline. Gerald would serve as a cultural and language consultant on a contracted basis. The compensation was not extravagant, but it was meaningful, and it was, for the first time in a long time, a reflection of what he actually was worth. Tanaka Haruto, before flying back to Osaka, sent a brief handwritten note to the hotel's general manager. It said, in Japanese, that he had been very impressed by the professionalism of the staff and specifically mentioned a gentleman named Gerald in housekeeping. The general manager, who did not read Japanese, had it translated twice. He called Gerald into his office the following Monday. What was said in that office stayed between them. But Gerald came out of it with a formal commendation added to his employee file, a salary adjustment, and an understanding, spoken plainly, without ceremony, that the hotel had not seen him clearly for 11 years and intended to do better. It was not everything. It was not nothing. There's something I want you to sit with before you move on with your day. That man in the gray uniform had been walking those halls for 11 years. 11 years of early mornings and quiet lunches, and a radio on his belt, and a cart that needed new wheels but always somehow kept rolling. 11 years of being invisible in the particular way that people become invisible when the world has decided, based on very little actual evidence, what they are and what they're worth. And in all that time, he never stopped being who he was. He didn't become small because they saw him as small. He didn't lose the language, or the knowledge, or the years in Tokyo, or the memory of negotiating contracts that shaped trade between two nations. He carried all of it with him, quietly, the way people carry the things that matter when there's no one around who thinks to ask about them. I think about how many Gerald Osei there are. In every hospital, every building, every room where the important meetings happen and the important decisions get made, where people who have lived whole other lives that nobody thought to inquire about, retired teachers, former engineers, people who once spoke 4 languages and now get asked to take out the recycling. We are so quick to read the uniform and stop there. The question Diane Mercer asked that afternoon, "Does anyone here speak Japanese?" was desperate. She didn't mean for it to reach the hallway. She didn't imagine that the answer was standing 20 feet away, holding 2 pitchers of water. But here is what I believe, and what Gerald's story asks us to consider. The answer is almost always closer than we think. The person who has exactly what we need is often the person we've been walking past without really looking. Don't walk past them.